is Claudio Viale. I am a researcher and professor in Argentina, in CONICET and the Catholic University of Córdoba. And we are presenting a roundtable on Dewey and Aesthetic and Education. First is Fabio Campioto. This is he works on Dewey aesthetics from the CONICET. He's a PhD student, and he has give you his thesis this year. He defended his thesis this year. Is from the Catholic University of Córdoba and the University of La Rioja in Argentina also. And Juan Saharrea, that is a postdoc fellow from CONICET, and he works in Dewey's philosophy of education. And he works in Catholic University of Córdoba and National University of Córdoba. I am first of all, Fabio will be presenting his talk. After that, Juan, and finally, I will present my talk. Fabio, you can start.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to be here. I'm going to share my screen since I'm going to show some slides with PowerPoint. Okay. I hope everybody can see. Okay. So the title of my presentation is The Anthropological Roots of Pragmatism Pragmatist Aesthetics between 1902 and 1911, a preliminary approach. This work seeks to accomplish two tasks. First, to reconstruct the emergence of an anthropological approach in John Dewey's thought during his decade at the University of Chicago. Second, to reveal how this approach informed some further forays by pragmatist philosophers such as James Tufts, Kate Gordon, and Dewey himself into the field of aesthetics. To carry out these tasks, I will divide my exposition in three parts. Firstly, I will address Dewey's essay Interpretation of Savage Mind as the starting point of an anthropological approach in his thinking. Secondly, I will stress its relevance in inspiring Dewey's focus on aesthetics on one hand, and that of his former Chicago fellows, Tufts and Gordon, on the other. Finally, these contributions will be framed within the American and European aesthetic scenarios at the turn of the century. So this is the first section, Dewey on Savage Mind. Dewey's approach to anthropology is a topic widely debated among scholars from different disciplines. According to Lecuisen, Dusk, Diesta, Goldman, Dreon, and Colon and Hobbes, Dewey began to nurture a fruitful interest in anthropology since his moving from Chicago to Columbia University, where for nearly 30 years he cultivated a personal and intellectual relationship with Franz Boas. A comprehensive reconstruction of the influence of Boas' cultural anthropology in Dewey's thought goes beyond the aims of this work. What I pretend to underscore here is the following neglect shared by these interpreters. By emphasizing Boas' legacy on one hand, and by focusing exclusively on Dewey's late production from Democracy and Education onward on the other, they all overlooked the article Interpretation of Savage Mind as Dewey's first serious approach to anthropological issues. At the beginning of the article, Dewey makes it clear his rejection of Herbert Spencer's anthropological position, arguing that savage mind should be analyzed as an integral part of the framework of present mental organization, instead of an inchoate stage of human evolution. In his view, there exist two major methodological problems within Spencer's approach. First, its tendency to heap together facts from very different peoples or tribes and to separate them from their social and natural context. Second, to take present civilized mind as a fixed evaluative standard, leading to a negative interpretation of savage mind in terms of lack, absence, and incapacity. To overcome Spencer's ethnocentrism, Dewey suggests taking occupations as the core of anthropological research. Quote, the biological point of view commits us to the conviction that mind is an organ of service for the control of environment in relation to the ends of the life process. We search in any social group for the special functions to which mind is thus relative. Occupations at once suggest themselves, end of quote. Since the end of the 19th century, occupations became a key concept in Dewey's pedagogy, psychology, and educational theory. For example, in The School and Society, he states that an occupation is more than a work which keeps an individual busy for the most part of his daytime. It is, in his words, a mode of activity that maintains a balance between the intellectual and the practical phases of experience. Meanwhile, in interpretation of savage mind, he gives the following definition of occupation. Occupations determine the fundamental modes of activity and hence control the formation and use of habits, being something more than practical and overt. The occupations determine the key modes of satisfaction, standards of success and failure. They furnish the working classifications and definitions of value. They control the desired process. They decide the sets of objects and relations that are important and provide the content or material of attention and the qualities that are significant. The directions given to mental life thereby extend to emotional and intellectual characteristics. So fundamental and pervasive is the group of occupational activities that it affords the scheme or pattern of the structural organization of mental traits. Occupations integrate special elements into a functioning whole. So important are thus occupations in shaping human mind and habits that they must be taken as the evaluative paradigm for all cultures. In this sense, hunting life differs from the agricultural or the pastoral because its main occupation furnishes different kinds of satisfaction, draw attention to different objects, stimulates and selects different psychophysical coordination, and so on. In short, different occupations lead to different ways of living, thinking, and acting by influencing human search for ends and meaning, both individually and socially. Following expert in education, Herbert Kliber, it can be said that understanding fundamental occupations not only gives us a keen insight into present mental operations, but also provides a way of understanding other features of cultures, such as religion, marriage, law, and by all means, art. For Dewey, Australian Aboriginals can be taken as a clear example of the hunting mental type. They do not have any knowledge of agriculture, of metals, of domesticated animals, and not even of a permanent home or proper means of transport. As in all hunting societies, food and sex represent the most important, persistent, and intense stimuli in the group's life. Differently from modern Western people, Australian Aborigines do not show any intermediate terms between the stimulus and the overt act, and between the overt act and the final satisfaction. Now, such facts should not be taken as evidence of a supposed ignorance, foolishness, or laziness of the savage, as in Spencer's. They rather show two key features that help us understanding our own civilized mind. First, hunting is an activity that develops sharp intellectual and practical skills in the individual on one hand, and assumes a complex tactical organization in the group on the other. Second, and more important for this research, quote, the hunting life is of necessity one of great emotional interest and of adequate demand for acquiring and using a highly specialized skill of sense, movement, ingenuity, strategy, and combat, end of quote. Differently, hunting societies have the prerogative to emphasize the emotional elements of life. In them, drama is not an additional component of life, but rather it corresponds to life itself. Quoting again, the interest of the game, the alternate suspense and movement, the strain and alert attention, stimuli always changing, always demanding grateful, prompt, strategic, and thoughtful response. The play of emotions along the scale of want, effort, success, or failure. This is the very type, psychically speaking, of the drama. The breathless interest with which we hang up on movement of play or novel are reflexes of the mental attitudes evolved in the hunting vocation. End of quote. In this context, art should not be conceived as the product of a refined, civilized mind, or as something detached from the normal processes of life. Art arises from life itself and feeds on the occupational stimuli by intensifying its more dramatic features. Aboriginal celebrations, called corroborees, are considered by Dewey a case. Quote, the art of the Australian is not constructive, not architectonic, not graphic, but dramatic and mimetic. Every writer who has a direct knowledge of the Australian corroborees testifies to the remarkable interest shown in dramatic representation. The reproductions by dances of the movement and behavior of the animals of the chase is startling. Great humor is also shown in adapting and reproducing recent events and personal traits. These performances are attended with high emotional attacks, and all the decoration, song, music, spectators shout, etc., are designed to revive the feelings appropriate to the immediate conflict situations, which means so much to the savage. End of quote. In the next section, I will show how these ideas, roughly outlined by Dewey in 1902, fostered some aesthetic approaches by exponents of the so-called Chicago School of Art. Let's see the second section, Tufts, Gordon, and Dewey on the roots and function of art. Despite William James' encouragement, in 1902, he boosted Dewey to keep up that line of study. Dewey never again adopted an anthropological insight in his Chicago production. Nevertheless, in the same period, his fellow James Hayden Tufts tried to adapt his ideas on savage mind to an aesthetic framework. In his essay on the genesis of aesthetic categories, his analysis of art revolves around three key points. The first one relates to the emergence of an aesthetic consciousness in human mind, which he believes should be connected with art rather than with nature. Primitive art can be taken here as a true example. It never showed plants and animals for their external aesthetic qualities, but for their meaning in common life as prized article of food or ancestral totems. Meanwhile, the second question refers to the precedence of artistic production over aesthetic appreciation. Tufts' art does not arise from innate appreciative capacities of the individual, but from an instinct for creation within non-aesthetic occupations. Otherwise, art is not rooted in the desire to gratify an already existing aesthetic demand for beauty, but develops in response to many and varied demands: economic, sexual, military, magical, ceremonial, religious, and intellectual. Aspect is sustained in the arts of motion, where the influence of magical, military, erotic, and religious motives is prominent. Within this frame, contemporary performative art, such as dance, theater, and music, try to reproduce, quote, in elaborated and refined form, the emotions of stress, contest, and victory which belonged to the earlier times, when a life based on occupations of hunting and fishing was a process containing far more of emotional strain and stimulation than our civilized one. End of quote. Finally, the third point stressed by Tufts refers to the social origin and function of art. According to the philosopher, in its beginning, art was not the expression of an individual mind, but has always been a vehicle for expressing social feelings, desires, and emotions. Primitive art ignored the concept of individual creativity and expressed itself through collective performances, as in the case of Australian corroborees, Tunisian rituals, or the music and chants that traditionally accompanied soldiers and workers. In these forms of art, rhythm was not only the greatest element of enjoyment, but also had the function to emanate a feeling of social sympathy shared among the members of the same community. Moreover, primitive forms of art, they were often related to rituals and festivals in which the individual could express the proudness for being part of a group. Among Australian Aboriginals, for example, those who refused to enroll in corroborees were condemned not for indifference towards art, but for disloyalty to the community. Taft's contribution can be considered the most direct antecedent of the second text I discussed, Pragmatism in Aesthetics by Kate Gordon, one of the most neglected philosopher among the Chicago School, despite an outstanding career in psychology, philosophy, and pedagogy. In fact, she has been student and assistant of both Dewey and between 1896 and 1903, and worked again with Dewey at Teachers College starting from 1906. In the preface of her 1909 book, Aesthetics, she points to Dewey, Tufts, and their fellow James Roland Angell as her main sources in that field. Moreover, according to Richard Schusterman, her article Pragmatism in Aesthetics represents the oldest academic statement in which the term aesthetics is associated with philosophical pragmatism, something that Dewey never did. In her contribution, Gordon attempts to answer to three main questions of art theory: what is art, when is art, and what is the function of art. About the first issue, she argues that art is a response to an impulse to objectify an emotion, which can be equally experimented by every human being. In her view, the term artist should not be limited to the professional art master, but should be extended to everybody who has seriously tried to express his emotion through one of the recognized media of artistic production. Although there are various motives that can push an individual to art creation, money, love, fear, emulation, among primitive people, quote, arts were practiced for the sake of conveying information, of stimulating fighting and working power, of exercising magical influence, etc., without having the product necessarily considered as a work of art, end of quote. Meanwhile, the second main issue revolves around the origin and nature of the emotional stimuli that lead to art. Quote, if art production is based on emotion, we have first to ask where the emotion comes from. We may distinguish a psychological and the social origin for it, thought we recognize that for primitive mind, the individual and social interests were not clearly differentiated, end of quote. From a psychological viewpoint, emotion is the consciousness of conflicted impulses. Primitive strife can be taken here as an example. A savage engaged in a fight with an enemy experiments a conflict of impulses, that of attacking and defeating his opponent on the one hand, and that of running away if his opponent assumes a threatening posture on the other. The result of this conflict is the emotion of angriness, which body language translates into an angry man in a fighting mode. The most desirable thing at the moment would be some means of fixing his resolution and augmenting his strength through repeated threats and feints and posturings that take the place of a real fight, end of quote. If this posture, determined by an emotion, is repeated with a frequency such as to originate a rhythm, we are in the presence of a form of art recognized as dance. When an act has been intercepted, the actor records that moment and, in a sense, objectifies his emotion by the repetition of that part of the act which he is able to perform, namely the attitude, end of quote. Meanwhile, question of the social origin of art is interviewed with that of its function. According to Gordon, the ideas of autonomy of art is freedom from desire, are misconceptions produced by modern society, where occupations and ideas are much more numerous in kind with respect to primitive life. She writes, our ideal community is not one in which every man is a hunter or a warrior, but rather a community in which every person is doing something a little different from every other. End of quote. Gordon agrees with us in saying that in primitive cultures, art had an explicit instrumental end, that of direct and incite the effort of the group. Quote, in the historical beginnings, the arts were useful devices for attaining success in specific types of activity. In the interest of the fight and the hunt, of law and religion, of magic and work, whatever primitive man wanted to exert his power, the arts came in to stimulate. Of quote. The last article I consider is Dewey's own aesthetic assessment in art and education. Although he was not new to dabbling in the philosophy of art, until then he had talked about art and aesthetics, several writings, lectures, and in his correspondence. Art in education certainly represents his first anthropological approach to this. Dewey's main goal in his brief study is to show the centrality of art in his educational scheme, at a time when both his philosophy in general as well as his pedagogy and theory of education were criticized for focusing narrowly on technical scientific. His idea, exposed on art, in continuity with his 1902 article and with the work of Tufts, can be divided into two crucial points. The first investigates the origins of art, and the second deals with its function. On the one hand, Dewey asserts that anthropological investigations have shown that the origins of art should not be sought in aesthetic appreciation, but in creative impulse, which arises naturally in every human being. Quote, instead of aesthetic appreciation coming first and leading to artistic expression in order to satisfy itself, the order is the reverse. Man instinctively attempts to enhance and perpetuate his images that are charged with emotional value by some kind of objectification through action. End of. On the other hand, anthropology has also identified the great part played by these creative impulses in the life of the community and in determining progress. Primitive communities, in fact, art had the social function to spread an emotional mood favorable to joint and concentrate in concerted action, and to promote the contagion of an emotion able to produce unity of attitude, outlook, and imagination. For Dewey, group activities have always been the soil of artistic creation. Quote, significant trait of the arts in their simple and more natural form is the prominence of the festal element. Tribal dances are the background out of which music, poetry, and the drama all gradually differentiate. End of quote. In sum, three main ideas are shared by the studies of Tufts, Gordon, and Dewey. First, art does not arise from innate appreciative capacities of the human being, but from impulses to objectify an emotion. Then artistic creation or action is prior to aesthetic enjoyment or appreciation. Second, creative impulses originate from emotions that occur in the framework of occupation. So in the framework of the non-aesthetic activities that regulate our lives. And finally, both the origin and the function of art are social. Art, far from being the product of isolated minds, originates from community festivals and ceremonies. Its function has always been to reinforce solidarity and empathy in the group. Conclusions. At the beginning of this presentation, it has been stressed that an anthropological approach in Dewey's philosophy has been referred by most scholars to the influence of Franz Boas. Without underestimating the contribution of Dewey's intellectual relationship with the German anthropologist, in this study, I attempt to show that an anthropological approach has already developed in Dewey since his time in Chicago, on the one hand, and that this approach was crucial in the aesthetic forays by some exponent of Chicago pragmatism on the other. The 4 articles I presented were published from 1902 to 1911, that is, at a time when Boas was already a well-known anthropologist in the United States. Nevertheless, in no one of the 4 contributions are Boas studies taken as reference. Thus, their main sources must be sought elsewhere, both in the American cultural milieu as well as in the European one. On the American side, the work of Chicago anthropologist W.I. Thomas deserves a particular mention. In Interpretation of Savage Mind, Dewey acknowledged the influence of his article, The Gaming Instinct, with the following words, quote, I am indebted to Dr. Thomas through personal conversation as well as from his articles for not only specific suggestions, but for the point of view here presented to such an extent that this article is virtually a joint contribution. End of quote. Another intellectual who played a part in shaping Dewey's and Tufts' approach was the social psychologist James Mark Baldwin. According to Thomas Fallace, both pragmatist philosophers took from him the idea that any attempt to explain human development had to be interdisciplinary in nature by incorporating psychology, anthropology, sociology, and child study. Moreover, both Dewey and Tufts collaborated with Baldwin in the writing of the Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology. Finally, Dewey, Gordon, and Tufts share the same anthropological concerns of a series of studies of both American and European aesthetics between 19th and 20th century, which are rarely considered in the main reconstructions of pragmatist aesthetics. In this frame, The Beginnings of Poetry by Francis Gummer belongs to the American aesthetic milieu, while the contributions of European aesthetics have been much more richer. Among them, we can mention The Origins of Art by Helsinki scholar Ido Hirn, the studies on primitive music by Richard Wallachek and Karl Bucher, the books of Karl Gross on animal and human play, as well as the aesthetic theory of Jean-Marie Guyot, a French philosopher appreciated by Harvardians William James, Josiah Royce, and George Santayana. Thank you for your attention.
Juan, is the turn of your presentation.
Okay, I have some slides too. I'm going to share. Can you see the first slide?
Yes, Juan, it's okay.
Okay. Well, thanks to the organization of 20th International Meeting on Pragmatism. Thank you, Eloisa, for the hosting. Thank you, Claudio, for the coordination. Well, I'm a postdoctoral fellow. I'm working about some aspect of John Dewey educational theory. Okay, this presentation is the result of my participation in the research group, whose director is Claudio Viale here. Well, the title is Experimentalism, Democracy, and Education, Deweyana Roots for Current Issues. What is the general objective? And a few aclarations. I will present some links between the concepts of experimentalism, education, and democracy within Dewey's thought. Dewey uses another expressions for experimentalism in his pedagogical texts. For example, experimental method, experimental thinking, or experimental attitude of mind. I will take in account as a background the years before democracy and education, from the appearance of pragmatism upon education, 1908, 1909, until democracy and education, specifically certain ideas of how we think, 1910. We consider this period as a center for Dewey's philosophy of education. Well, my aim is to demonstrate that there is a relevant argument related to the link between experimentalism and democracy in Dewey's pedagogy that supports a certain recovery of Dewey's work within the pragmatist political thought. The last year has been a recovery of Dewey experimentalism within pragmatist political philosophy or political philosophy in general. I'm thinking in three authors: Elizabeth Anderson, that is a representative of social epistemology; Joseph Stenders, that wrote an excellent book about political methods; and Greg Pappas, that is in fact the only really pragmatist political philosopher. But all three think that Dewey's political thought is very different to the model of deliberative democracy. They think that Dewey political thought supports an experimentalist democracy that is very different to the formal model of a deliberative democracy. And although Pappas thinks that this possibility that we take a model of experimental democracy in formal terms, this is a risk. In general, the idea of experimental democracy supports or favors an idea of substantive democracy. Okay, in short, Deweyan experimentalism supports a substantive idea of democracy that is very different of the model of deliberative democracy that is related to John Rawls' theory of justice and the Rawlsian authors. Leaving apart the consideration of this critic from Greg Pappas, we can affirm that experimentalism is a good name, okay, to do his idea of democracy. These considerations are the starting point of my argumentation, okay? I think that we can say that in general it is supposed that it's very clear the idea of experimentalism in Dewey's work. In general, it is supposed that the main sources for understanding Deweyana experimentalism are two: The Quest for Certainty, 1929, and Logic, a Theory of Inquiry, 1938, and minor texts related to the subfield of epistemology or political thought. But Dewey develops the idea of experimental method and experimental habit of thinking in his pedagogical texts. I think that from this consideration, I would like to ask two questions from these considerations. How does Dewey develop the idea of experimentalism in his pedagogical text in the first place? And secondly, is there something new in his way of linking democracy and experimentalism in his pedagogical text? I think that this last one is the most important question. And I think that there is something new. Regarding the classical idea or exposition of experimentalism, I took the paper of Leonard Walks about experimentalism, post-experimentalism in pragmatism, that provides an excellent characterization of the topic. Walks also recognized the importance of the link between experimentalism and education. Okay, this paper really inspires my ideas and our project in general. My specific objectives are two. Firstly, to reconstruct Dewey experimentalism from his educational text in the period from the Bearings, okay, to Democracy and Education, 1916, and point out certain challenges facing contemporary democracy that were highlighted by Talisi, Rigg, and Leckham, and Jason Stelling too, and to see how Dewey educational experimentalism responds to this problem. Okay, so for my argumentation, is necessary to situate Dewey's philosophy of education. As you know, democracy and education is probably the most important work in Dewey's philosophy of education, but it's the peak, however, of a long process of thinking, writing, and doing of education. It is well known that one of the fundamental reasons behind Dewey moving from the University of Michigan to University of Chicago revolves around education. At the later institution, one of his central activities in the Department of Education was the foundation of the laboratory school, an institution based mainly on his own theoretical perspective. Consequently, Dewey's approach to education was twofold, empirical as well as theoretical. During his period at Columbia University, after being in Chicago, Dewey wrote several texts on education that registered this double approach. I'm thinking in The Bearings, and that is probably the first text where Dewey recognized himself as a pragmatist. He also wrote How We Think, about his experience in the lab school, a Cyclopedia of Education, articles where he defines the core concept of pedagogical theory, emphasizing his own approach, and School of Tomorrow, a very interesting text with his daughter Evelyn. They actually analyze what actually happened when different American reformist schools put into practice theories of education. For all those texts, we have chosen How We Think. Why have we chosen How We Think? Well, there are many reasons. Firstly, How We Think, I'm a teacher. Dewey thought has a sort of handbook, okay? Secondly, it is based on the experience of the lab school. In the preface, Dewey says, my fundamental indebtedness is to my wife, by whom the ideas of this book were inspired, and through whose work in connection with the lab school existing in Chicago between 1896 and 1903, the ideas attained such concreteness as comes from embodiment and testing in practice. Okay, Dewey in How We Think defends the core idea of his pedagogy, that is reflective thought or reflective thinking. Okay, this notion might be for Dewey a clue of unity. He says, he uses this expression in the preface, of the course of studies or curriculum. Okay, we think that this necessary has a group differentiate the idea of reflective thinking to the idea of critical thinking that is related to Matthew Lipman project of philosophy for children. Reflective thinking, finally, is another way to say habits of exploring and testing. Well, how do we present the idea of experimental thinking in How We Think? Okay, how is his argumentation? Dewey presents in the first part of How We Think the definition of the experimental method, two definitions, and both arise from the contrast with what he calls the empirical method of thinking. Okay, the empirical method consists of the mere recognition of the conjunction of two regular events. This is Dewey's example. A says, it will probably rain tomorrow. Be asked, why do you think so? And A replies, because the sky was lowering at sunset. When B asked, what has that to do with it? A responds, I don't know, but in general does rain after such a sunset. How can we say about this example? It is an inductively valid conclusion, but it has a disadvantage related to the explanation as to why it will be rain, okay, beyond mere conjunction. In Dewey's works, he's thinking in A, he does not perceive any connection between the appearance of the sky and coming rain. He's not aware of any continuity in the facts themselves, any law or principle, as we usually say. The empirical method has many disadvantages, but one is central thinking in its impact in education. And Dewey uses the expression mental inertia, laziness, and unjustifiable conservatism. This disadvantage has some bearing for the educational context. For understand this negative impact, it's necessary to understand the idea of tendency, okay? Pointing out the empirical method has a tendency, as Dewey does it, implies that it's not something given by nature, on the one side. In fact, because the social environment contributed to drive them, they are tendencies needing constant regulation on the other side. And in this part, it's interesting because Dewey draws on the analysis of, especially Francis Bacon, to point out the sources of error in belief or misbelief, in more general terms. Dewey defends that in the modernity we have some of the attempts that had been made to classify the main sources of error in reaching belief. Bacon and his analysis of the idols is the predicate example for Dewey. He says, the idols or phantoms of, the tree, the marketplace, the cave or den, and the theater. And he gave some interpretation of this classification and says, considers Bacon classification, we have that two are intrinsic and two are extrinsic. Of the intrinsic, one is common to all men alike, we say, such as the universal tendency to notice instances that corroborate a favorite belief more readily than those that contradict it, while the other resides in the specific temperament and habits of the given individual. Of the extrinsic, one proceeds from generic social conditions, like the tendency to suppose that there is a fact wherever there is a word, okay, and no fact where there is no linguistic term, while the other proceeds from local and temporary social currents. According to Bacon, so these tendencies tend to be confirmed and favor habits of thinking. Dewey thinks that if we consider this idea of tendencies, there are some bearings or consequences in the function of education, okay? Because it's necessary to avoid these tendencies. He says, at present, the work of teaching must not only transform natural tendencies, okay, into trained habit of thought, but must also fortify the mind against irrational tendencies current in the social environment and help displace erroneous habits already produced. The emphasis is ours in this case. So, for this, it is necessary to educate considering certain tendencies that are nature, and aiming at certain habits of thinking. What are those habits of thinking? Well, that is the idea, or here comes the idea of reflective thinking or experimental method. That implies this idea, a set of habits that are necessary to carry out such regulation, okay? What does the experimental or scientific method consist in this context, within this context? Scientific method, that is experimental, we say, replaces the repeated conjunction or coincidence of separate facts by discovery of a single comprehensive fact, effecting this replacement by breaking up the quartz of gross facts of observation into a number of minuter processes not directly accessible to perception. Attending to this, we can point out certain characteristics of experimental methods in education. Unlike the empirical method, it seeks the reasons for conjunction or regularities. Secondly, it is sensitive to modification of facts or circumstances. Thirdly, it allows to think of a justified plan of action. And finally, even when it might fail, it allows to maintain an open-minded, non-dogmatic attitude. But how is possible this experimental method in the context of the schooling, okay? To favor the experimental method in the school, it's necessary to control the environment. That is the expression of Dewey, control. The idea that the school should censor or control It's an unkind, uncomfortable idea. However, if we consider the idea of certain tendencies of thought that often characterize contemporary societies has a risk inherent to, first, our human condition, and two, second, the condition of contemporary societies, it does not sound so bad. Okay, I'm thinking the challenges facing contemporary democracy. Okay, I return to this recovery of Deweyan experimentalism in part. Okay, for example, strong polarization tendencies and over politicization. Polarization means the idea that I believe what my candidate believes, for example. Okay, and over politicization is the idea that everything is political, every aspect of the life is political, and so always there is some polarization related to everything. After authoritarian position and even fascism as a self-propagating rhetorical phenomenon in social media in Crick's work, recently exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We are talking about the people who denies the science in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, okay, and at the beginning of the meet. In these cases, the rhetorical framework of tendencies needing constant regulation is insightful, we think, to think in solution to this problem, okay? We can shape certain educative experimentalism, thinking in this consideration. These problems, these challenges require rethinking not so much the formal system, but the public space. In other words, it requires an idea of substantive democracy has offered by Dewey's experimentalism. Now, the task before us in Dewey's terms involves thinking not only about public debates in general, okay, but also thinking in a model or project of education. This is where we understand experimental democracy needs and can't ground an experimental, needs to be grounded in experimental education, and experimental education can support an idea of experimental democracy, okay? A very important detail that is that it is more difficult control tendencies after the period of schooling. Well, let's go to conclusion. We can go deeply in this question at the moment of the question or demands. Deweyan experimentalists involve not only certain political ideas or logical ideas, but certain pedagogical ideas. Okay, we found these insights developed in the period before democracy and education, and in the context of the lab school, specifically in Dewey's defense of reflective thinking developed in how we think. The idea of reflective thinking involves fostering certain habits as well as controlling certain tendencies. The result of this control are habits of thinking. Attending to the challenges facing democracy, nowadays, Dewey's educative experimentalism is an interesting possibility to avoid or at least discourage unthinking or irrational tendencies in Dewey's terms. The idea of tendencies assumes a naturalistic view of belief that is entirely pragmatist, in line with a defense of a pragmatist conception of the belief, okay? And finally, although it was sustained that Dewey became more skeptical about the effects of education in ensuring how to think the years went by, okay, his educational experimentalism never ceases to play a key role in ensuring a democratic society. Thanks.
Gracias, gracias. Thank you, Juan. I will present my talk. Well, my talk today is called too neglected root of Dewey aesthetics. Sorry. Well, it is well known that John Dewey, as a philosopher, write on education, on epistemology, moral philosophy, political philosophy, and among other branches of philosophy. In our research group that I coordinate at the University of Catholic of Córdoba in Argentina, it's called Pragmatism and Education. In this group works Juan Saharrea, in Dewey Philosophy of Education, Fabio Campioto in Dewey Aesthetic, and also Laura Haubert in Dewey's and Santayana's Aesthetic in relation to the Barnes Foundation. The focus of our research is in Dewey's view of education and the relation of education with aesthetics, and our point of departure is that Dewey's approach is not always systematic. So we try to find the connection between both fields in his philosophy. The two neglected root of Dewey aesthetic, that is a paper we are working on with Fabio and Juan Campiotto, Fabio Campioto and Juan Saharrea, is that there is a fragmentary aesthetic that is important to consider analyzing in Dewey aesthetic in general, and also an educational aspect that is not always present in the literature. To do that, I will split the talk in three parts. The first one is the genesis of Dewey aesthetics, interpretation. The second one is Dewey and education, central issues. And the third one is true neglected root of Dewey's aesthetics. The first part, the genesis of Dewey aesthetic reinterpretation. Artist Experience is the most famous books of Dewey regarding aesthetics. It is well known that Dewey aesthetics usually quoted with artist experience. For us, this is part of the canonical interpretation that tend to conceive Dewey's philosophy in using his term grooves. Democracy and education will therefore belong to the groove of philosophy of education. Logic will be part of the groove of the theory of knowledge. Artist experience will be the core of aesthetic, the aesthetic groove, etc. Two different causes, a philosophical and meta-philosophical one, converge at the bottom of this interpretation. The first rely on professional philosophers' narrow specialization in the development of our activities. The second one is meta-philosophical, since, independently of their philosophical filiation, a great number of professional philosophers have an irremediable theoretical inability to take history seriously. Unfortunately, historical perspective and genetic approaches in philosophy are frequently far more the claim that really apply. In relation with aesthetics, the so-called revival of pragmatism that started in the 80s could be split in two parts. The first part that we call secondary literature one is mainly the books of Thomas Alexander. It's well known that John Dewey's Theory of Art, Speech and Nature, the book of Richard Schusterman, Pragmatic Aesthetics, and also the book of Philip Jackson, John Dewey and the Lesson of Art. Despite their very valuable contribution, they do not systematically deal with three core aspects of Dewey's thought: links between aesthetic and education, the relevance of his context of production, especially minor or so-called minor texts, and his fragmentary aesthetic. Although this gap has been filled to some extent by recent literature, there remains a lot to be done. This literature, this recent literature that we call secondary literature 2, we could call David Granger, Nakamura, George Hayne, and Alexander Robbins, among many others. This and our approach also here that for in a paper that we have published in Cognitio in 2018, that is called Barnes' Influence on John Dewey Aesthetic, a preliminary approach. Between a crucial difference there exists between secondary literature 1 and secondary literature 2. That is, secondary literature 2 deals with a fundamental aspect of Dewey's aesthetic neglected by secondary literature 1, that is, the ties of Dewey with Albert C. Barnes and the Barnes Foundation. In secondary literature 2, this relationship is worked and analyzed and examined, but in relation with mainly with aesthetics, and not with Dewey's conception of education and his philosophy of education. And this is the task that in which we are working specifically. The second part of my talk is Dewey and education central issues. There are three categories or topics or issues that are very important for our research. That is occupation, art teaching, and the overcoming of dualism between vocational and humanistic school. I exemplify using two different texts from John Dewey what we have in mind with using this category. The first is one quotation of a paper of Dewey that is called Culture and Industry in Education from 1906, when Dewey said that there is then something almost ludicrous, something at least paradoxical in our situation. We proclaim the growing importance of industry as an educational factor at the very time when we have discovered that play is the key to education. We are fighting, on one hand, child labor in the factory, while we are urging child industry in the school. In truth, this situation will present an insoluble contradiction were it not for the intervention of art. End of quotation. Another quotation is from the classic book of Dewey, Democracy and Education. The continually increasing importance of economic factor in contemporary life make it the more needed that education should reveal their scientific content and their social value. For in school, occupations are not carried on for pecuniary gain, but for their own content. Freed for extraneous association and from the pressure of wage earning, they supply modes of experience which are intrinsically valuable. They are truly liberalizing inequality. This quotation is from Democracy and Education. Relating to us, three parts, three axes or three features are important to remark. One of them is that the scientific content, the social value, and the aesthetic quality. In curriculum, this is articulated usually in natural science, in humanities. Both aspects appear explicit in canonical works of Dewey, and the aesthetic quality is articulated in curriculum in art and aesthetic education. That is implicit or marginal in canonical works, are present or very present in minor text. So both statements, the first one, in truth, this situation will present an insoluble contradiction where it's not for the intervention of art, and that education should reveal their scientific content and their social value, present a very different scope within Dewey's conception of philosophy of education and education. And this demand an accurate reconstruction of Dewey's work from the present. Finally, the third part of my presentation is two neglected roots of Dewey aesthetics. The first neglected root of Dewey aesthetic turn around his fragmentary or piecemeal aesthetic. Barnes' ideas had a strong influence in its development. We may ask, what would have happened if Dewey had not developed a close friendship with Barnes? Would he have extensively dealt with aesthetics as he did in his mature years? Would Dewey even have written art experience? These counterfactual questions are very useful to visualize, examine, and reconstruct core aspects of Dewey's systematic aesthetics. For us, the Barnes Foundation is to Dewey aesthetics what the laboratory school is to his pedagogy and philosophy of education. Within this framework, which would be the consequence of Barnesianism in Dewey aesthetic be? A short answer is the pairing of aesthetic and education. Although this pairing, unfortunately, was not clearly made in art as experience, a revaluation of Dewey aesthetics allows us to make it visible. In other words, emphasizing the importance of his fragmentary aesthetic and his correspondence, that is, going beyond the centrality of art experience, we would overtly appreciate the links between aesthetic and education in Dewey's thought. This is, and this is one of the ways to do that through some text of Barnes. The first one of them is the following, that Barnes writes in The Problem of Appreciation. We perceive only what we learn to look for, both in life and art. The experience of the artist arises out of a particular background, a set of interests and habits of perceptions, which, like a scientist's habits of thought, are potentially shareable by other individuals. They are only shareable, however, if one is willing to make the effort involved in acquiring a comparable background and set of habits. To see as the artist sees, that is the catchphrase of Barnes, is an accomplishment to which there is no shortcut, which cannot be acquired by any magic formula or trick. End of quotation. This conception of this Barnes conception is developed in Dewey. Conception of perception is almost the same in art as experience. The second neglected root of Dewey aesthetic turn around the links between education and aesthetics. democracy and education, we have said before that in democracy and education, there is a not very deep dealing with art teaching and aesthetic, while in art experience, the canonical book of Dewey in aesthetic, there is not a deep dealing with education and aesthetic education. There is a lack of the dealing of aesthetic in and education in both books. If we take it both simultaneously. Consequently, as his conception of the link between aesthetic and education is in his major books are manifestly inaccurate, we should go beyond Dewey, or more precisely, beyond the canonical Dewey, making a reconstructive endeavor. In this vein, the first step is to state that submining Dewey's philosophy in grooves is clearly misleading. The second step is to acknowledge the aesthetic and education are necessarily linked within his philosophy. And the third one is to show how this connection should work. And here enter the three concepts of Dewey that we have referred before: occupation, art teaching, and overcoming of dualism between vocational and humanist school. I will refer here only briefly to occupation for a question of time. The important question is, why specifically are occupations so important in relation to aesthetics? And the answer is, because two grains converge in occupation that otherwise would be dangerous split. Industriousness as an essential element of education on one hand, and play as an activity free from all external constriction on the other. In other words, industriousness without an effective link with play ran the serious risk of becoming a crass instrumentalism. Play, on the other hand, without a coherent link with a practical phase, runs the serious risk of becoming superficial leisure. Sorry. Art as occupation, or occupation as art, could be the phrases that capture the links between aesthetic and education on one hand, and make explicit Dewey's overcoming of the dualism between vocational and humanistic education on the other. Consequently, to conceive art as occupation is a necessary step to acknowledge a neglected root of the aesthetic, his link with education. Thank you. Well, we have now time for question and from an we open the session for the debates and if there are any questions, we will start with them.
Can you, yes, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if there are questions in the chat or no.
I don't think so.
Bueno. So, first, Alejandra or
Bob? Professor Robert first.
Bob, how are you? You should.
You have to unmute the microphone.
Okay, now you can hear.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
No.
Bob.
Yes. If we can.
Okay, Alejandra should go first.
Well, mine? No.
Okay.
You can go first, no problem. Well, I can answer. Thanks for your presentations. They were really great. I would like to make a consideration and a question for you three. Because on one side, it seems like the role of emotions is important in cognition. The role of emotions are important in cognition. At the same time, it seems like experimentalism in education is supported by inductive reasoning. It seems like. So in this perspective, I would like to ask you, which is the role of emotions in this experimentalism? And which are the links between this educational experimentalism and social values and aesthetic qualities? Because I think that these issues are involved in all three of your presentations, and I would like you to explore a little bit more. Thank you.
Fabio, Juan, no sé,
Fabio,
you can start or that?
Okay.
You start. Then we'll add something, maybe.
Okay. Thank you, Alejandra, for your consideration, for your question. I think that this a very complex point. What is the relation between emotion and the linguistic knowledge or propositional knowledge? But for me, a key in Dewey's experimentalism, thinking in text as how we think, is the idea of learning by doing, and specifically the interest. The interest has a condition to achieve a learning, okay? So I think that Dewey doesn't go deeply in this text, how we think, for example, in the topic related to emotions, for example. I think that this is a topic more related to aesthetics, and in that sense, I think that Claudio and Fabio can say anything about it. But the idea of learning through a reflecting thinking is the idea to take some interest, some occupations, in fact, that are very spontaneous, make something from this situation. So, in short, I think that the interest is a condition to the learning, and in that sense, we can think in the interest is related to certain emotions. By another side, I think that propositional knowledge, linguistic knowledge, is a secondary aspect in the model of pedagogy of Dewey. I think that his educative pragmatism is his model of education is related to a conception of a know-how abilities, okay, that favor a model of thinking. As Claudio and Fabio have insisted in your papers, Dewey tries to supersede the dichotomy between a vocational and technical education, okay? So in that sense, I mean, I think that this point is related to your question, because the idea is, well, the knowledge mustn't be a question of memorize propositional content, but to do something, okay? But I think that Claudio and Fabio can go deeply in this consideration. But thank you for your question, and you let me thinking about this point in how we think.
From an aesthetic viewpoint, I can say that for Dewey, since his activity in Chicago, emotion is a crucial point in what he calls occupation, which is much more than a mere technical job or a work that the person that occupies a person the most part of his daytime. For him, it is the overcoming of the division between the thinking and the doing, and finds in art his higher expression. You know, this work was true, especially among ancient societies for Dewey, where and we lost that prerogative for the social division between the working class and the leisure class. And in Democracy and Education, Dewey says that this comes from Aristotle, that divides the society into two different parts, and art became, since then, something that can be cultivated only by the leisure class. So by whom has the time and the cultural possibility to appreciate it.
Well, I think in relation briefly regarding your question that is behind this both the aesthetics and also the education is the anthropological aspect of Dewey thought, because that Fabio wanted to we are starting to work in this direction, and also that Juan is working in connection between some texts of Dewey before Democracy and Education. And there is especially one text that is crucial for our research that we have translated to Spanish, and the next year will be published in a journal, that is the beginning of Pragmatism upon Education. And this text is crucial, but is the first text in 1908, 1909, that Dewey acknowledged himself as pragmatist, and he presents that the crucial point of pragmatism for him was anthropological. That's, we are essentially practical human creatures, and although in this and the view of aesthetic we have in modern society should be connected with the form that we have previously in like hunters, or that we disconnected or compartmentalized view of aesthetic of education or some different part of philosophy should be overcome to an unified view, and this is an anthropological point, and we are practical being, human, practical creatures. No, that is, and in this case, the connection and the emotion and cognition and very deeply connected in this way. Bob, your question is?
Am I next? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All of your materials, to a certain degree, stand outside of what was Dewey's really perhaps his greatest book, namely Artist Experience. And these materials are in a certain sense, imminent to the book, but not explicit, because the book has a very, very different tone. And if you try to dig deep down into artist experience, you find a rather different set of operative philosophical notions. For example, James's image of the flights and perchings of a bird from the principles appears in very different forms, like a motif throughout artist experience, of this very sense of the substantive and the transitive forms of consciousness. And it would be impossible to think of artist experience without that various notion of movement on, stopping, art as initiating forms of transitions and linkages between elements and experience. The second point I would make is that if you do a word search in artist experience and typed in quality, you would find that is perhaps the word that appears most all throughout Dewey's aesthetics. And it is not the word that is in artist experience, and not really the word emotion. That is, he's talking about quality, affect, affective. You look up the notions of affective tone, affective quality. They appear in multiple ways. The reason I know this is that my own book on dimensions of aesthetic experience is getting ready to be sent to the printer. And I'm working over the index now. So I have become very familiar with what has appeared in these texts and appears throughout artist experience. So my remark would be that there's a theory of quality lying in Dewey's, lying latent throughout Dewey's artist experience. And that to a certain degree, it came from Peirce, not exclusively, because he wrote that famous paper in 1935 that was published in 1935 called Peirce's Theory of Quality. And that he says that Peirce's great contribution to philosophy was to give a full analysis of experience as experience. So he saw right there an aesthetic linkage with Peirce. The third point I would make is there is a funny footnote in artist experience that refers to Samuel Alexander. And in Dewey's correspondence, which none of you, I don't think, referred to, he wrote two letters, one to Alexander and one to Corinna Chisholm, about how he had come across the materials called Art and that is Alexander's articles on art and the material, and cosmic creation and aesthetic creation. And Dewey cites those papers in the artist experience, and then he said, hung 4 comments. Those comments, in a certain sense, give you a skeletal structure of what Dewey wants to do, and has done. And those are, I think, imminent roots in our artist experience, and not the external framing which went into artist experience, but was not made explicit in that culminating expression of Dewey's own mature aesthetics. All the other elements, I think, that all of you have mentioned are there, but they're there not as constitutive, I think, as the theoretical underpinnings. They are there as motivating structures and as forms of contextualization. Those are not really objections. They're just sort of commenting notes in the margin of what all of you have so very helpfully put forward for us.
Do you want first or?
Yes.
Right.
A brief comment, really short. How are you, Bob? First of all, I hope you're good. Well, you are right about the Persian roots. Actually, well, in the study, 2 neglected roots of Dewey's aesthetics that Claudio mentioned, the study that we are working on, we say at the beginning that there is a Persian theory of quality that we are not working now, but we mentioned in a footnote, and we mentioned a work by you. And then there is another paper from Dewey from 1955, Affective Thought, that Dewey wrote that paper and published in the Journal of the Barnes Foundation while he was working in his logic in 1925. He started working in his logic, and there is a letter to Albert Barnes where he says, well, I put together some material on logics that I'm working now for a series of conferences. I want to do a book about this, and I think that these ideas fits with your conception of art and aesthetics, and send that paper that I think is important as well. But yes, you are right. You are right about an influence of Peirce theories of qualities, and well, we are not working on that now.
I think that that you say it is right that Fabio have said, but and the connection with Peirce in this decade is very important, and with theory of quality and affective, etc. But it was a little surprising for us when we make our research how in democracy and education there is not a really deep dealing with aesthetic and art and education, despite he has written a lot of this in minors text. Mm-hmm. And also there is, I think, in art experience there is a deep dealings with quality and with this with quality and affective thought, etc. But there is also a lack of dealing with education, a systematic dealing with education. So our attempt is to reconstruct Dewey in this part, because in this sense, because we want to make explicit the links, the implicit or they're not systematically deals between both aspects, and because this is not only a reconstructive attempt, but it's also important to think Dewey in the present, and Dewey related with the educative system of the present. For example, we think all his discussion with Sneeden about the technical, the overcome to this distinction between technical school and humanist school is very useful to think how to think the culture and the institute in the schooling today, no? And I think that we in a moment we will work in this connection between Peirce and Dewey and Paniel Reyes Cárdenas. And here we have some projects maybe in common regarding this. But the point is very complementary with us. But our purpose is to make this link between aesthetic and education explicit. I don't know if I have answered. Paniel, you have a question also?
I have.
Okay.
I just made a remark.
If there are other, okay, Campeotto.
Oh, sorry, Bob. No, I was just saying that I just made a comment on the chat. What Maria Alejandra said.
Can you read, Claudio?
Oh, you want me to say?
I don't know, Bob or Paniel?
No, Paniel should go.
Should go, okay.
No, go ahead.
Well, quick. I won't take long. It's just with regards to the relationship between emotions and education and the kind of processes of inference. It seems to me that in logic, the theory of inquiry, one of the movements that you can find in describing the processes of inference, and one that Dewey actually uses vindicating pairs, it's this movement of including emotions, including what he calls affective states. So it seems to me that just with regards to what Maria Alejandra said, and coming back to Juan in his great presentation, I think kind of a growing consideration of this in Dewey's part, and just wanted to point out that logic, the theory of inquiry, seems to be the place for that kind of solution of that problem. Thank you. That's all.
Bob?
Yes, I just a follow-up. It deals with a central text that I think it was Claudio who presented it, with the contrast between industriousness and play. And you made the comment that that play was without restrictions. But as far as I can see, the very concept of play depends upon restrictions. It depends upon rules, whether they're explicit or whether they're merely implicit. But their field of play involves a strict distinction between what is an allowable move and what is not an allowable move. So you are never fully free in play. You have to play within the logic of the game. And if you use the analogy of play for aesthetic experience or aesthetic production, I'm playing with the materials, but you can only play with the materials within the restrictions of the materials. And if you are playing with interpretations of a work of art, you are also constrained and restricted. There are systems of resistances that do not allow you to interpret the Mona Lisa as an advertisement for a trip to Tuscany because you like the background. It doesn't work that way. And I wonder whether we are making a kind of fallacy, committing a fallacy of false alternatives by opposing industriousness and play. I know it's in the text, but yes. But we would have to read exactly what industriousness there means, mindless following of rules, while play involves a very creative use of the rules, that you know the logic of the play better than the other people. So if it's in team sports, that team will win, etc. But it's just a final sort of thing about, I wonder whether we have to be careful about straight lining these two notions as if they are truly opposites.
I think, Bob, that the reference to play that Claudio did was referred to child play intended as a kind of natural expression of an idea. Something that Dewey writes during his Chicago era in a very good paper called Imagination and Expression from 1896, that should be read in continuity with the one about the reflex arc concept. So play here is considered, the child play. So the need the child has in any moment to express his ideas or his feelings. These are, I think, is the notion of play that Claudio mentioned before. I don't know.
Oh, good. Very good. Good.
I have one comment related to regarding the comment of Paniel in logic, a theory of inquiry in the chapter, I think that is chapter 5, before the most knowledge chapter of the needing of reform of logic, something like that. Dewey criticize, first of all, reconstructs the Aristotelian logic with that reconstruction is a magistral reconstruction of Aristotelian logic, but he at the final of this chapter he criticized Aristotelian logic because he thinks that there is something clasista. How can I say clasista, Claudio? Classistic or in Aristotelian logic, because Dewey says that Aristotle was thinking in modes of investigation that are not the modes of investigation related to the manual works, for example. So he thinks that if we attend or if we consider some technical works or modes of working, that will have an impact in our modes to consider the logic. So I was thinking when in this question, when Paniel talk about or write about the motion, because and this question I connected with Maria Alejandra's comment or remark, how a person for Dewey recognize a problem is perception ability, okay? And in that sense, the spontaneity of the perception, that is one characteristic of our perception, must be trained in a sort of aesthetic way, okay? I think it is another point where aesthetic and emotions are very important in the process of education or of learning, according to this idea of reflective thinking, okay? But it's really interesting how Dewey criticized as a classist the Aristotelian logic.
Well, I don't know if there is another question or comments. Well, if there is no another question, we close the session. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Paniel. Thank you, Ivo, for this event. And I hope that the next year will be there in São Paulo.
Yes, I'd like to say something and to congratulate all of you. And the debate was excellent. The exposition of all of you was excellent, as usual, when this Argentinian consulate is present here. And then always with a high level of treating philosophical matters. And so my congratulations and my deep thank you to you. Okay.
No, thank you for you and your wonderful team, Ivo.
Okay, let's continue together. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Congratulations.
Well,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye Bob.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Vai parar a